The winter came like a closing fist. By the end of the second moon, even the elders stopped saying it was just a hard season. The wind didn't howl, it scraped. Trees split from the cold, not the weight of snow. Rabbits vanished, snares iced over, and the river made a sound like bone when it froze solid in the dark. Firewood vanished. It didn't matter how much they'd stacked, it wasn't enough. Wet logs hissed but didn't burn. Smoke clung to the air like guilt, and the scent of it carried far. Wolves followed it. So did hungrier things. People whispered about Silent Ash. He was older than most, but didn't look it. Face like wind-worn stone, eyes always half-lidded, like he was listening for something beneath the snow. He didn't say much, but that winter he said less. When others begged for coals or complained about damp kindling, Silent Ash disappeared into the snowdrifts, not to gather wood, but to dig. They thought he'd lost his mind. He hadn't joined the hunts. He hadn't begged the firekeeper for scraps. He hadn't traded for dried meat. He just kept returning to the same circle he'd carved into the snow outside his lodge, a ring of woven reeds covered in ash, surrounded by dead cedar branches, pressed into the frost like some old rite no one remembered. At first, no one asked. Everyone was too cold, too hungry, but they watched. One day, when the wind was still and the dogs weren't barking, he opened the circle. From beneath a layer of snow, under bark and pine needles and ash, Silent Ash lifted a basket. Not a basket for kindling, a food basket tightly bound, still dry and heavy. He didn't call attention to it. He just took it into his lodge, cut it open with a blade that looked older than the hills, and laid out its contents. Steamed roots. Yellow corn, still bright. Strips of winter squash wrapped in birch bark. Nothing spoiled, nothing frozen, nothing burned, no fire. Just heat that came from patience, from layers. From a method that defied the logic of the others, a child peeked into his lodge and ran back to tell her mother, "He has food." "No, he has warm food," she said. By nightfall, word had spread. Some dismissed it, said he'd been hoarding, said he must have traded in secret with another band. Others stared at the smoke rising from every other lodge and noticed that his had none. Silent Ash sat alone that night, chewing on something sweet and silent. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat, but he looked out at the forest like he heard it whispering, "They'll come," because hunger always does. Long before the snow, before even the leaves had turned, Silent Ash had started preparing. Not like the others, not by stacking firewood or drying strips of venison in smoke tents. His work was quieter, stranger. In the heat of summer, he walked into the forest with a carved digging stick, a stack of cedar bark, and baskets he'd woven himself. He filled them not just with food, but knowledge corn with the husks still on, roots scraped but unwashed, squash halved and cured in the sun, and berries pressed flat between branches of pine. He buried them deep, but not all in one place. Each basket had its own resting spot, marked not with stones or symbols, but with subtle shifts in the land. A leaning birch here, a patch of sage there, the curve of a shadow that changed with the season. He wrapped the baskets in layers of bark and ash, then sealed them with woven mats laced with pine pitch and moss. No one saw. He never let them. His grandfather had warned him, "You do this when no one watches, not because it's shameful, but because if they don't understand, they'll call it forbidden. And when the hunger comes, they'll forget they ever judged." The method wasn't written down. It couldn't be. It relied on rhythm, not science. The ground had to be just cold enough to sleep, but not freeze. The baskets had to breathe without letting the snow bite. The ash had to be dry enough to ward off mold, but soft enough to let heat rise when uncovered. To those who believed only in flame, it was madness. But to the land, it was harmony. Silent Ash remembered how his grandfather had first shown him. He was a boy then, no older than the pine needles that dropped in his shadow. The old man had dug up a squash in the middle of winter, still sweet, still firm. He'd handed it to Ash and said, "Fire forgets. The earth remembers." So Ash became a listener. He watched how animals cached food in frozen ground, how snow insulated more than it destroyed, how cedar kept the rot away, how air flowed under layers of woven bark, rising slowly like a breath trapped in prayer. By the time the cold came, he wasn't surprised. He didn't need to panic. Didn't need to light the fire that drew wolves. His food was already waiting, like memory, and it didn't rot. It rested. Because not all food is meant to be scorched. Some is meant to survive the silence and wake only when called. The wolves came the same night the fourth family burned their last log. Their howls didn't echo. They pressed into the lodge walls, low and steady, not crying out, but circling, looking, listening, waiting for weakness. They moved like smoke themselves, silent but sure. Drawn not to blood or meat, but to the scent of desperation. It clung to the smoke rising from nearly every chimney in the village, except one. Silent Ash's lodge gave off no smoke. No flicker of firelight glowed behind his hide flap. No sound of crackling wood or snapping bone. Just silence, the kind so thick it bends the snow around it. The others huddled close that night, whispering stories about him. He eats, but never cooks. He hasn't asked for wood in weeks. He sleeps through the worst of it. How? But no one dared knock. Not yet. Inside, Ash sat beside a small stone-lined pit, not for fire, but for steam. From the ash today basket he'd dug up earlier that day, he pulled strands of dried squash and corn, still wrapped in their husks. He placed them inside a hollowed gourd, added a bit of snow, covered it with cedar bark, and rested it over a warm stone he'd buried deep under ash hours before. The snow hissed, the gourd warmed. The food softened, not cooked, but coaxed back to life. Steam rose, invisible in the cold air of his lodge. It smelled like earth, like memory, like enough. Even the wolves paused near his tent. They sniffed the wind. No smoke, no meat, no signal of weakness or wealth. They passed him by. But the next morning, 2 hunters appeared at his door, not from fear, but hunger. Their cheeks were hollowed by wind. One limped, frostbitten. The other held a steel knife with a cracked handle, useless against frozen roots. They hadn't come to accuse. They came with their heads bowed. "Teach us," one of them said, voice cracking like dry cedar. Ash didn't answer. Instead, he pulled another basket from the snow, handed it to them, and said only, "Eat first, understand later." They opened the basket slowly. Inside was maize still gold, roots that bent instead of snapped, and slices of something that smelled faintly of berries and bark. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't dead. It was alive. No fire, no salt. No spoil, just food that had waited. And when they bit in, they looked at each other not in joy, but in something older. Shame. Because they realized what they'd mocked was never magic. It was remembering. And the wolves, sensing no weakness, didn't come back. By the 7th moon of snow, the village had changed. Not because the weather broke, it hadn't. Not because the hunters found more game they didn't. And not because firewood had suddenly appeared, it was still gone. What changed was where they looked for warmth. One by one, the villagers stopped asking how Silent Ash did it. They started asking why they had never seen it before. Why they had trusted smoke over silence, steel over bark, flame over earth. The 2 hunters who came first returned with their families the next morning. They didn't bring tools. They brought baskets, old ones, long neglected. And they asked what kind of bark to use, where the air hole should go, how far down to dig, when to bury, when to wake. Ash answered with gestures, not lectures. He showed them how to strip cedar without breaking it, how to pack dried sage between root vegetables to stop mold, how to use snow not as a threat, but a blanket to insulate, to preserve, to slow the rot instead of fighting it. It wasn't a method, it was a rhythm. The ones who learned fast didn't come from books. They came from watching. A girl no older than 10 figured out how to weave the reed mat lids tighter than Ash himself. An old man who had lost most of his hearing noticed the way wind curved around the mounds and taught others how to position theirs just right. Soon, the smell of smoke became a sign of weakness, not strength. It meant you had nothing stored. It meant you were late. It meant the land had spoken and you hadn't listened. And slowly, food returned not from trade or luck, but from memory. Ash didn't ask for thanks, but they gave it anyway, not with words, but in silence. They began carving his pattern into their lodge doors. Children traced the basket symbols in the snow before play. Even the dogs stopped begging near the fires. They lingered near the cold pits where buried meals waited, warm enough to eat. Then, one day, a woman approached with a question. "Why did your grandfather teach this to you and not the others?" Ash didn't answer at first. He simply held up a piece of cured corn, pressed it to the snow, and watched it stay whole. Then he said, "Because he knew I would feed people without being seen. That was the lesson. Fire feeds you fast, then leaves you empty. But the earth waits. If you treat it like an enemy, it starves you. If you treat it like a partner, it feeds your children's children." And in that winter, the people learned. Warmth doesn't just come from heat, it comes from trust. When the thaw finally came, it didn't rush in like a blessing. It crept slow, wet, and cautious, as if testing whether the village had earned it. The snow softened underfoot. The ice in the river cracked like old bones. Buds pushed up through the bark like breath returning after too long beneath the surface. And still, they kept digging. Not for firewood, not for game. For the last of the buried baskets. Because now it wasn't just survival, it was ritual. The children dug with reverence. Mothers whispered instructions as they peeled back layers of bark and ash. The men, once proud of how much they could burn, now measured their worth by how little they had needed to. Silent Ash watched from his lodge, never speaking unless asked. His hands still moved with purpose, weaving, scraping, listening. He didn't hoard, he didn't preach. But every morning he walked the edge of the forest and left behind small bundles, dried squash, bark-wrapped roots, cedar-woven rings, not for people, for the earth. He called it giving back to the memory that had fed him. One boy, curious beyond his years, finally asked what the trick had been. How Ash had kept the food warm without flame, sweet without sugar, fresh without smoke. Ash looked at him, eyes soft beneath the lines carved by wind and time. "There was no trick," he said. "Only a prayer." The boy blinked. "But you didn't speak." Ash shook his head slowly. "Some prayers are not for speaking, they're for listening." That was what the world had forgotten. Modern men prayed with their mouths and begged with their smoke. They built machines to overcome nature, then cursed the land when it didn't obey. But the old ones? They prayed by planting at the right moon, by burying food in just the right slope of earth, by layering ash with intention, by knowing which root breathes and which one sleeps, by trusting the land to remember them, too. What they once called forbidden was never magic. It was humility, and when that returned, so did the abundance, not just of food, but of rhythm, of meaning, of the kind of wealth you can't count, only pass down. Now, when strangers visit the village, they marvel at the lack of smoke, the quiet confidence, the way children smile while pulling perfect food from beneath snow. They ask, "How is this possible?" And the elders only shrug. "It's not," they say, "unless you listen." So the trick lives on, not in books, not in museums, but in dirt, in silence, in baskets that breathe under snow. And it still feeds the ones wise enough to bow their heads before they ever lift the lid.